This card. Anyone can print this off the internet, Derek snarled, hurling the veteran ID onto the counter as if tossing trash. Raymond Hale, 74 years old, froze in place. His aged eyes blinked once, slow, wounded, humiliated. Whispers rose behind him. Some customers shook their heads. Others turned away, pretending not to see. Ray spoke softly, his voice tightening in his throat. It's real. I bled for it. Derek flicked his hand, his tone cold and sharp. If you want a discount, prove it. Otherwise, pay full price and get out. The air inside the supermarket thickened. It felt as if one wrong breath could shatter everything. Silence pressed down like stone, and Ray was humiliated right in front of everyone. If you believe true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the quiet endurance of those who survived war, then subscribe to brave veteran stories and help us preserve the memories, the dignity, and the honor of our silent heroes. Raymond Hale lived in a small, rented house at the end of an old road where the grass grew tall enough to brush his knees, and the front porch chimed softly whenever the wind passed through. The house didn't have much, only long stretches of silence, and the memories he had never dared to sort out. Every morning, Ray woke early before the sun had even risen above the line of trees in the distance. The tiny kitchen still held the faint smell of the weak coffee he drank each day, just to have something warm. On the table sat only an old cup and a faded photograph of Margaret, the wife who left him 3 years ago, leaving a hollow space in the house that nothing else could fill. Ray's income wasn't much better than most elderly veterans. His military pension covered the rent, his medication, and a few small expenses. Everything else had to be considered carefully. He was used to that. Used to turning off lights to save a little. Used to fixing worn-out shoes instead of buying new ones. Used to telling himself, as long as I have enough to get by, that's enough. That afternoon, Ray opened a drawer and took out a folded shopping list he had written with shaky handwriting: eggs, bread, chicken, milk. The list was simple to the point of looking sad, but it was all he needed. Standing in front of the mirror, he slipped on his old jacket, straightened the collar, then placed the faded 101st Airborne cap on his head. The cap wasn't just for shade or warmth. To Ray, it was a fragment of a past he could never let go, a small symbol showing he had once belonged to something far greater than himself. Ray stepped out of the house and opened the door of his old Ford Ranger, the one he had driven for more than 15 years. The driver's seat had a small tear, the dashboard was chipped, but the truck still ran. And for Ray, that was enough. He buckled his seatbelt, turned the key, and the engine trembled slightly, as if gathering its strength to serve him one more time. The road to Red Star Supermarket wasn't far, but Ray drove slowly. He was accustomed to this pace of life, unhurried, uncompetitive, steady, like a man who had seen far too much, and now wanted only to enjoy the peace he had left. In his mind, he reviewed his list, thinking about the simple dinner he would make, thinking about the young days he rarely spoke of, days only Margaret had known. When he arrived, Ray turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds. He watched the stream of people heading into the supermarket, families, busy young adults, children arguing over candy. Ray no longer belonged to that noisy world. He had become a man who blended into the crowd, unnoticed, unrecognized, unseen by people who had no idea where he once stood in history. He opened the truck door, stepped out, adjusted his airborne cap, and quietly walked toward the entrance. On the way, he pulled out his list again. He murmured it softly, as if repeating it would steady his heart. Eggs, bread, chicken. That's enough. Sometimes Ray wondered whether this peaceful life was a reward for those who survived, or simply a reminder that war had taken too much and left him with too little. But Ray never complained. He never had. He simply lived quietly, remembered quietly, and felt quietly grateful for the fact that he was still here. He stepped through the supermarket doors, feeling the chill from the air conditioning. One hand held the basket. The other rested gently on the brim of his cap, as though protecting the last piece of dignity that belonged to a man who had walked through war. And in that gentle, unassuming moment, the storm he never saw coming was already gathering, waiting for him at the checkout line, where his pride would soon be trampled in front of strangers he didn't even know. Ray stood waiting at checkout lane 7, gently rubbing the veteran ID inside his wallet, a habit he used to steady himself. Every time he used that card, he felt both pride and unease. Pride because it was proof of the years he had worn the uniform of the United States. Unease because younger people sometimes didn't understand or didn't care what it meant. When his turn came, Ray set his basket down and handed the card to the cashier. The young woman looked at it, frowned, and pressed the button to call the manager. Ray's breath fell slightly. He knew these signs. The doubtful glances, the looks that swept over him as if he were trying to cheat a few dollars. The cashier spoke hesitantly. "Sir, please wait a moment. I don't know how to process this." Ray nodded, trying to keep a thin smile on his face. "It's okay, dear." Just a few seconds later, Derek, the manager, barely in his 20s, walked over. He snatched the card from Ray's hand with 2 fingers, as if holding something cheap. He flipped it back and forth, eyebrows tightening in annoyance. Behind Ray, customers began making small, impatient sounds. A man sighed. A woman whispered to her friend. "Probably fake again." Derek looked up, stared straight at Ray, and raised his voice loud enough for the entire line to hear. "Old man, these things get faked all the time. You're not fooling anyone." The sound of that sentence cut into Ray like a blade. Silence spread as if everyone was waiting to see how he would react. But Ray only lowered his head and reached for his wallet. His rough hands trembled slightly. He began counting each small bill, worn $1 notes, crumpled $5 bills he had collected over the week. Each bill was placed down carefully, partly because he didn't want to come up short, partly because he didn't want anyone to see how his hands were shaking. Derek folded his arms, looking at Ray with irritation. "Pay the full amount and you're done. Simple as that." Ray didn't answer. He finished counting the money and pushed a few coins onto the counter. No one moved. No one defended him. The people around him just stared, some with indifference, some with impatience, others with eyes that had never learned what it meant to respect a veteran. When Derek shoved the bag toward him, Ray picked it up with both hands. His eyes lowered as if pulled down by the weight of humiliation. He walked away from the checkout in silence, moving slowly, his shoulders slightly hunched. Each step felt heavy, as though he were stepping across his own memories. Memories of a man who once stood at the edge of life and death, who once believed wholeheartedly in a country that now allowed someone to call him a liar. No one followed him. No one apologized. No one asked if he was all right. Ray was left with one feeling, that he was becoming invisible. He walked past rows of shelves overflowing with food he no longer cared to see. Inside, Ray felt so empty, he couldn't even hear the whispering behind him. He felt only one thing: his dignity had just been broken by someone, and he didn't have the strength to pick it up again. At the entrance, Ray paused for a moment and took a long breath, but it wasn't enough to soften the sting he had just endured. He adjusted his cap, trying to hide the slight trembling in his face, not from being doubted, but from realizing a colder truth: some people no longer knew how to respect a veteran. He walked toward his truck, gripping the grocery bag more loosely than when he had left the counter. The feeling of being degraded made him seem older by several years in just a few minutes. But Ray didn't know that in that very moment of silent humiliation, someone else was watching someone who would change everything that had just happened. And from that quiet, painful moment, the battlefield memories Ray had buried for so long began to rise again, like a wound that had never truly healed. Ray stood beside his old Ford Ranger, set the grocery bag down on the passenger seat, then paused. He removed his faded 101st Airborne cap and placed it in his hands, as if he were holding something sacred. The Screaming Eagle emblem had worn down over the years, but to Ray it remained the symbol of a promise that had never dimmed. The evening wind brushed past, touching his silver hair. Ray looked at the cap, and in an instant, the old images came back fast, fierce and uninvited. He heard the first helicopter, then the crack of bullets tearing through the air, the shout of a young soldier beside him, another collapsing to the ground, with a final breath full of confusion. Those days had never truly left him. Ray had simply learned to bury them deep within his mind. But today, the humiliation he endured at the supermarket had scraped against those memories, dragging them back like a flood. Ray closed his eyes, and the voice of his former commanding officer echoed so clearly it felt as if he had heard it just that morning. "Hail, hold that position." "They're closing in," Ray answered under his breath. "Yes, sir. Hold the position." He saw again the day his unit moved into a dense jungle area, not knowing how many enemies waited ahead. 40 men. Young, strong, full of belief. But only 12 walked out. Years had blurred Ray's memory, but not their faces. The boy from Texas who always smiled too wide. The 20-year-old newlywed who kept a photo of his wife in his chest pocket. The men who shouted, "Hail, go first. We'll follow you." Ray opened his eyes, staring at the cap he was gripping. He spoke softly, like a confession meant for no one but himself. 40 went in. 12 came out. The words carried no pride. They carried sorrow. They were the weight Ray had carried on his back for more than 50 years. The ones who didn't return were always with him in every breath, in every dream, in every quiet moment the world thought was ordinary. Ray straightened up and took a deep breath. He looked back toward the supermarket in the distance, the place where a young man had so casually dismissed the years Ray had spent standing on the edge of life and death. He wasn't angry. Ray had never been one to anger easily. But another feeling rose inside him, a grief so tight, it felt like his past was asking him a single question. Why do they forget so quickly? He placed the cap back on his head, adjusting it the way he had done for half his life. That small action felt like an answer to himself. No matter who doubted him, no matter who belittled him, he knew exactly who he was. Ray opened the truck door and sat behind the wheel. The worn interior of the Ranger seemed to wrap around him like an old friend who knew every scar in his heart and never asked for explanations. He set both hands on the steering wheel and tightened his grip to calm the emotions rising inside him. Everything in him grew quiet, though it wasn't true peace. It felt like the calm of a man who knew he no longer belonged to the loud world around him, but still tried to live with dignity, kindness, and the values the Army had once carved into him. Ray stared ahead for a few seconds. The familiar question resurfaced in his mind. Does anyone still remember the men who walked beside me? He had no answer. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: loss never leaves the soldier who survives. And just as Ray started the truck to drive away, another pair of eyes was quietly watching him, the eyes of the one person who recognized the airborne emblem on that faded cap. Sarah Miller stood still at the end of the checkout aisles, her hand still gripping the grocery bag she had bought just minutes earlier. She didn't know Ray and had never met him before, but what she had just witnessed burned in her chest, like someone had struck a match. She had watched every second of Derek humiliating an elderly veteran, watched the indifferent faces around them, watched Ray lower his head, not resisting, not blaming, just silently, enduring, as if he had grown used to being forgotten by the world. What made her stop was the cap on Ray's head, the faded airborne cap with a screaming eagle emblem so worn it was barely visible. She knew that cap wasn't something people picked up at a flea market for fun. She had served before she had been a captain. She knew exactly who had the right to wear it. And she knew that the people who carried that emblem on their head were not the kind who lived on lies. Sarah drew a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen lit up, reflecting a face tight with anger, but also full of determination. She dialed the number without hesitation. "Good afternoon. This is the office of..." She cut in her voice, low but steady. "I need to speak with General Carter immediately." There was a brief pause before the duty officer's voice came through. "Captain Miller, please hold for a moment." Sarah heard the line transfer, then the deep, familiar, authoritative voice on the other end. Carter speaking. She straightened instinctively, an old reflex coming back. "General, there's a serious matter. I'm listening." Sarah looked toward the parking lot, seeing Ray's figure moving slowly toward his old Ford Ranger, so quiet, so weighed down it made her chest tighten. "Sir, a 101st Airborne veteran was publicly humiliated at Red Star Supermarket, accused of using a fake ID, treated with contempt in front of everyone." She swallowed, then pronounced each word clearly. "Name Raymond Hale." The line fell silent, not a meaningless pause, but a silence of sudden recognition. Hale. Which Hale, Raymond? "Hale, sir." Several heavy seconds passed before General Carter's voice turned razor sharp. "Captain, are you absolutely certain you heard correctly?" "Yes, sir. I saw it with my own eyes." A heavy breath sounded through the phone, followed by a short sentence carrying the force of a battlefield order. "I'm coming immediately." Sarah tightened her grip, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She hung up and stood still for a few seconds to collect herself. She knew General Carter was not the kind of man to be moved by trivial matters. If he said, "I'm coming immediately," then to him, this wasn't just an insult, it was an injustice that could not be allowed to stand. Sarah looked toward Ray one last time. He was opening his truck door, his movements slow and heavy, like a man worn down by a burden no one else could see. She whispered to herself, "You deserved better than that." In that moment, her heart was pushed by a responsibility she had carried since the day she first put on a uniform, to never let a veteran be abandoned in silence. And just as General Carter left his office and headed for Red Star, the air in the supermarket still hung with the cold sting of injustice, a quiet pause waiting for the moment the doors would swing open and change everything. The supermarket doors swung open, and the atmosphere inside seemed to shift instantly. A man stepped in with a perfectly straight posture, each step radiating the discipline forged from decades of service. His uniform was sharply pressed, the rows of medals gleaming on his left chest, each one representing years of unforgiving battlefields. General John Carter, a four-star general of the United States Army, entered the space that moments ago was noisy, but now felt unsettled, as if everyone suddenly sensed they needed to be quiet. The checkout area froze. A few customers turned to look, then instinctively stepped aside to make room. The younger ones didn't know who he was, but the way he stood, the way he observed, made it clear he was no ordinary man. General Carter didn't stop at the entrance. He walked straight toward checkout lane 7, where Derek stood with the kind of careless expression only someone unaware of the consequences of his actions could wear. Sarah Miller followed a few steps behind him, her eyes filled with both sternness and a quiet shame for how Ray had been treated moments earlier. When they reached the checkout, Carter stopped directly in front of Derek. No introduction, no polite preface. His voice rang out loud, clear sharp like an order fired across a battlefield. "Are you the one who just humiliated a combat veteran here?" Derek froze his face, losing all color. I thought the card was fake, sir." Carter stepped closer, his voice dropping lower, but growing even more severe. "You insulted Lieutenant Raymond Hale, the man who saved over 200 lives during Saigon in 1970. The words fell like thunder. A few customers gasped. Several people put down what they were holding and stood still. No one in the supermarket dared to move, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Carter continued, each sentence punctuated with weight, as though he wanted to carve them into the memory of every person present. "He is not just a veteran. He is one of the men who stood where most young people today cannot even imagine standing. He held the line so his fellow soldiers, doctors, and civilians could live and return home. And you," he pointed straight at Derek, "you treated him like a scammer in a supermarket." Derek's hands shook, his eyes reddening. He looked around, hoping someone would shield him, but no one spoke. Instead, the heavy silence surrounded him, a kind he had never felt before. A silence not aimed at Ray, but at him, the one who had committed an unacceptable act of disrespect. The young cashier beside Derek lowered her head, lips pressed together. She hadn't taken part in the mistake, but she felt ashamed for standing by without saying anything. A mother holding her child whispered to her husband, "Oh God." "Ray Hale. I've heard about the Saigon battle." Carter turned to Sarah. "You're certain he's Hale?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I saw his airborne cap and his ID. There's no mistake." Carter scanned the entire checkout area, his gaze stern but not blinded by anger. He was doing what any soldier understood, protecting the dignity of the ones who came before them. He spoke again, this time with a low, weighted voice filled with the emotion only someone who had buried brothers in arms with a man like Raymond Hale must never be treated this way. Not today. Not ever. Derek bowed his head, fingers clenched tightly together. "Sir," he stammered, "I'm sorry. I truly didn't know." Carter didn't respond immediately. He let the apology hang in the air, letting Derek feel the full gravity of it, because some mistakes cannot be brushed off as unintentional. Some people's honor must be defended even when they themselves remain silent. And in that moment, as the tension stretched through the air once more, the lesson meant for everyone in that supermarket began to form clearer than ever. The supermarket fell silent, as if someone had suddenly turned off all sound. Everyone stood waiting for the next words from the four-star general towering at the checkout area. Confused, embarrassed eyes were fixed on him, as though the entire room had been pulled back to a truth they had forgotten for far too long. General Carter took a deep breath, then turned toward everyone present. His voice was low, steady, and free of unnecessary words. "We honor veterans, not because they ask for respect." He paused for a moment, letting each person feel the weight of what came next. "We honor them because they paid for it in blood." Some in the crowd bowed their heads. An elderly man placed a hand over his heart. A young mother gently soothed her child, who watched the scene without understanding. No one said a word. Everyone was standing before an undeniable truth. Derek swallowed hard, his hands visibly trembling. He tried to stay upright, but his shoulders sank as if all the strength in him had drained out. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I truly was wrong." The words were neither sharp nor strong, but they carried the panic of someone who had just realized the consequences of his actions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice softer, but just as firm. "A veteran, any veteran, no matter their rank, no matter where they served, deserves to be treated with dignity." She looked around at the crowd, letting her gaze settle on each person, as if wanting them to remember. All of them deserve it. No exceptions. A gray-haired man nearby sighed. We are sometimes too quick to judge. A young man lowered his head and murmured, I never thought about it this way. General Carter turned back to Derek, but his tone was no longer as harsh. It carried the guidance of someone older, someone who had seen too many mistakes in life. You are not wrong because you didn't know. You're wrong because you disrespected something you didn't understand. Derek looked up, eyes red. I'll take responsibility. I'll make it right. I'll never treat a veteran like that again. Carter gave a slight nod. No applause, no cheers, no noise. But that very silence was the sign that something important had happened. Everyone understood. They understood that there are people living among them who carry stories no one knows. They understood that the peace they enjoy today was bought with memories no one wants to relive. They understood that respect is not a gift, it is a duty. Sarah looked out toward the parking lot, where Ray's Ford Ranger had disappeared behind a row of cars. She whispered to herself, he should never have had to go through that. General Carter heard her. He nodded gently, then spoke softly, just loud enough for her to hear. Today, we're going to make things right. A sense of responsibility spread through the room, as if every heart in the supermarket had been touched by a painful truth. And as General Carter stepped away from the checkout, the decision to find Ray and apologize to him in person had already formed clearly in his mind, opening the final chapter of the story, where honor would be restored to the man who deserved it. Late afternoon settled over the small house where Ray had lived alone for many years. The last light of day stretched softly across the old wooden porch. Ray sat there, both hands resting gently on the faded 101st Airborne cap that had been with him for more than half his life. The worn stitching, the creased fabric, each mark felt like a long story only he truly knew. As the wind moved through the almond trees in the yard, Ray exhaled slowly. The sting of humiliation from the supermarket was still there, thin but deep like a small cut. Yet beneath that sadness, he saw more clearly the faces he had lost long ago, the comrades who remained in the jungles of a distant country. Perhaps it was because of them that being doubted today hurt him so deeply. The sound of a car stopping in front of the house pulled him from his thoughts. Ray looked up. 3 people were walking through the gate, General Carter, Sarah Miller, and Derek. The 3 paused for a moment, as if wordlessly asking for permission. Ray rose slowly, his back straighter than before, a posture he had carried since the day he first wore the uniform. General Carter stepped forward. His face was solemn, but his eyes held a respect not many had witnessed. Lieutenant Hale, he said, my apologies for coming without notice. Ray nodded slightly. You're here because of what happened at the supermarket. So you know, Carter replied, then continued with a firmness mixed with reverence. Tomorrow the city will hold a ceremony to honor you. Your story deserves to be told. Ray fell silent. He looked down at the cap in his hands, then up at the people standing before him. His voice rose slowly, steady and deep, like the voice of a generation that had endured great loss. If you're going to tell it for the ones who never came home. Not for me. Carter answered with a heavy, respectful nod. We will, Lieutenant. Derek stepped forward, head slightly bowed. His face no longer carried arrogance, only genuine remorse. I'm sorry, he said in a trembling voice. Everything I did today, all of it was wrong. I disrespected a man I should have honored. Ray looked at him for a long moment, not to intimidate him, but to ensure the apology came from the heart, not from fear. Then he placed a gentle hand on Derek's shoulder. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is fixing them. At those words, Derek broke down in tears like a child. Sarah stood nearby, her eyes softening. She looked at Ray the way one might look at the thousands of veterans she had known, quiet men, humble men, asking for nothing but the smallest measure of respect. A cool evening breeze moved across the yard, brushing against the folded flag resting on the shelf behind Ray, a flag he had kept for years, like a promise to those who never returned. Ray looked at the flag, then smiled softly. It was a rare smile, gentle as a breath, but enough to warm the fading light of the evening. For the first time in many years, he felt that the sacrifices of his comrades and his own were no longer buried in silence. Carter sensed it, and he stepped back slightly, giving space to the peace that had finally returned. Lieutenant Hale, he said quietly, thank you for your service. Ray answered with a slow nod, full of the dignity of an old soldier. When the 3 visitors left the yard, Ray remained on the porch, one hand resting on his cap. The sunset shifted colors, And in that moment, Ray knew he was no longer alone in his memories. The men who had fought beside him were finally being remembered, honored, and spoken of once more. And in the calm of the descending night, a message from the younger generation seemed to echo inside him, a message he had waited a lifetime to hear. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, then, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that not a single memory of theirs is ever forgotten.